students. You don't have a choice. You must sign this divorce papers before you die.
How dare you wish me death? Dare you wish me death because of my money?
Jessica married the old billionaire for his money, planned every step of the divorce, and had a lawyer ready to take $500 million. But what the old man did next shattered everything she thought she knew. The room smelled like leather, old money, and polished wood. Jessica stood beside the massive desk, dressed in black and white, beautiful, composed, and trembling beneath the surface. Her hand rested on the thick prenuptial binder, as though she had already claimed the world. Across from her sat Harold Whitmore, the old man everyone whispered about in Atlanta high society. He was 68, sharp-eyed, silver-haired, and rich in the kind of way that made younger men lower their voices when they spoke to him. His inheritance alone was rumored to be worth more than $500 million. His businesses, property, stocks, and hidden trusts made the real number even harder to guess. To the public, Jessica was the lucky young wife who rose from nowhere into a life of chandeliers, chauffeurs, and private wine rooms. To herself, she was a woman who had finally outsmarted the cruel world that once laughed in her face. And beside her, leaning forward with worried eyes and a tightening jaw, stood Joshua. He was 31, tall, handsome, tired, and carrying a quiet pain that expensive suits could never hide. Most people in that room thought he was there as legal support, because he had once studied business and now worked for a small downtown consulting office. But the truth was more complicated and far more dangerous. Joshua knew Jessica before the gowns, before the diamonds, before the television interviews and curated charity smiles. He knew the girl who once sat with him on cracked apartment steps and talked about impossible futures. He knew the woman who once said she would rather struggle with dignity than eat at the table of a monster. He also knew how lies change shape when hunger stayed too long in a person's life. Jessica looked at the divorce papers again. Her lawyer had told her this day would be simple. Harold was old. Harold was frail. Harold had no children of his own. Harold was attached to her. Harold would settle. Harold would rather lose money than dignity in public. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Jessica only had to stay calm, look wounded, and make him believe she was emotionally done. Then she would walk away rich enough to never fear rent, shame, hunger, or humiliation again. She drew a slow breath and prepared to begin. She did not know that before the hour ended, every secret in the room would start breathing. Long before Jessica married Harold Whitmore, Joshua Bennett had his own beautiful dream. He used to stand on the rooftop of his mother's apartment building in South Fulton and stare at the city, lights like they were speaking directly to him. He believed that one day he would build something honest, powerful, and lasting. Not a hustle, not a shortcut, not a scam dressed up as ambition. He wanted to build affordable housing communities for Black families who had spent generations being priced out of every safe neighborhood. He wanted clean buildings, fair rents, secure parks, and schools close enough for children to walk without fear. When professors asked him why he cared so much about real estate policy, he never gave the polished answer. He always told the truth. Because he was tired of watching hardworking people treated like they were temporary in their own city. Joshua had the grades, the discipline, and the vision. At Morehouse, people said he would be somebody. At 24, he had internship offers, investor meetings, and the kind of sharp mind that made older executives pay attention. At 26, he had a small team, a community plan, and a partnership draft that could have changed everything. Then life did what it often does to men who think effort alone will protect them. His father died. Medical debt swallowed the savings. A trusted mentor used Joshua's name to close a fraudulent land deal. Investors fled. Court notices came. His business collapsed before it ever took its first full breath. By 29, Joshua was not building communities. He was working under people less gifted than him, reviewing contracts in a cramped office, and pretending that temporary failure did not feel permanent. His mother thought he was still destined for greatness. His little cousin still called him the smartest man in Atlanta. But Joshua had started waking up with that private ache known only to men, who remember their former selves too clearly. He still wore ambition on his back, but disappointment had settled into his eyes. The world had lowered him. Not broken him completely, but lowered him. That was where Jessica found him again. Or maybe that was where he let her find him. Jessica Monroe was not born cold. People always assumed women like her came into the world calculating. That was the lazy version of the story. Jessica came into the world beautiful, poor, watchful, and fast at learning what people valued more than truth. She grew up in a neighborhood where beauty was both currency and danger. Her mother worked double shifts as a nursing assistant and still came home with apology in her voice whenever the lights flickered. Her father disappeared so early that his absence became part of the furniture. Jessica learned young that kindness did not pay overdue bills. Grace did not stop eviction notices. Talent did not silence landlords. Still, she once had real dreams. She wanted to become a television journalist. She loved strong women with precise voices and fearless eyes. She used to rehearse interviews in the mirror using a hairbrush as a microphone. She wanted to tell stories that mattered. She wanted to be respected for her mind before anyone noticed her face. Then life educated her in a harsher language. At 19, a supervisor offered her advancement that had nothing to do with work quality. At 21, a landlord flirted while discussing late rent. At 23, a churchwoman told her to use what God gave you wisely, as if beauty was not a burden first. By the time she met Joshua, she was still capable of softness, but no longer naive enough to believe softness would save her. Joshua made her laugh in those days. He made her feel seen in a way that did not reduce her. He asked about her dreams and listened like the answer mattered. He looked at her as if she were a future, not an ornament. For a while, that was enough. Until the world tested both of them at the same time. Joshua's fall into debt and professional ruin changed him. Jessica's rising fear of poverty changed her faster. Love survived for a while, but fear is a ruthless third person in any relationship. Soon, every conversation sounded like pressure. Every promise sounded delayed. Every hopeful plan sounded like hunger wearing clean clothes. Jessica did not stop loving Joshua all at once. She simply began to love safety more. Happened at a charity gala neither Joshua nor Jessica should have been attending. Jessica was there because a friend's cousin worked event staffing and slipped her an extra invitation. Joshua came because a former classmate insisted that serious networking still happened in rooms, where wealthy people performed generosity under chandeliers. The ballroom glowed gold that night. Black silk gowns moved like expensive secrets. Old money laughed softly. New money laughed too loud. And Harold Whitmore arrived like the room belonged to his bloodline. He was not the loudest man there. He did not need to be. Power was already sitting on his shoulders. He was flanked by politicians, donors, and men who became overly respectful whenever he turned his head. Jessica noticed him before he noticed her, not because of his age, not even because of his wealth, but because everyone in the room subtly adjusted around him. She watched the deference. She watched the access. She watched doors open without being touched. Joshua noticed her watching. He smiled at first, thinking she was simply reading the room. But then Harold approached their table himself. He complimented Jessica's elegance. He asked what she did. He listened too long. He held eye contact too steadily. Joshua answered one question for her, and Harold barely acknowledged his existence. That small disrespect landed like a warning. Jessica felt it too, but she did not step away. By the end of the evening, Harold had arranged for her to meet the director of a media foundation. He had also given her a private card with a number that did not appear online. Joshua hated the card before she even slipped it into her purse. Jessica said it was networking. Joshua said old men like Harold did not network with young women unless they wanted to purchase something. Jessica snapped that poor men always call opportunity dangerous when it does not belong to them. The argument in the parking lot lasted nearly an hour. Neither of them forgot a single word. After the gala, Harold kept appearing in Jessica's life, with the smooth precision of a man used to moving unseen. A recommendation here, a lunch invitation there, a placement on a non-profit media board, a luxury gift she initially refused, then accepted after rent hit late. Jessica told herself she was still in control. She told herself she was using the system, exactly the way the system had used women like her for decades. Joshua did not believe that. He saw the danger before she admitted it even existed. He saw how Harold's help always came wrapped in personal access. He saw how Jessica's language started changing. She stopped talking about purpose and started talking about leverage. She stopped asking what was right and started asking what worked. One rainy evening, Joshua met her outside a downtown restaurant after she ignored his calls all day. He found her stepping out of Harold's black sedan, wearing a coat far more expensive than anything she could afford. She looked embarrassed for only half a second. Then pride took over. Joshua asked her if she was really doing this. Jessica asked him whether he intended to pay her debts, rebuild his failed company, and rescue both of them from the future they were sinking into. Joshua said he was trying. Jessica laughed, not because it was funny, but because pain had sharpened into bitterness. She said trying was beautiful when the rent was already paid. Joshua told her Harold was buying influence over her life. Jessica told him the world had bought and sold people long before Harold Whitmore was born. Joshua stepped closer and lowered his voice. He told her there were prices that left permanent marks on the soul. Jessica's eyes hardened. She said souls do not keep the lights on. That was the night Joshua realized love might not be enough to compete with desperation. That was also the night Jessica crossed a line she would never fully uncross. A month later, Harold invited her to his estate. 3 months later, society pages started calling her his companion. 8 months later, she wore white. The wedding was intimate, elegant, and calculated to appear tasteful rather than outrageous. Harold understood image. Jessica learned quickly. The guest list included judges, ministers, board members, television hosts, and enough polished black elite families to make gossip travel for years. The media framed it as a surprising but sophisticated union. Some called it romance. Most called it strategy behind closed doors. Joshua did not attend. He saw the photos online while eating. Takeout at his desk. After a 14-hour workday. Jessica looked radiant, expensive, untouchable. Harold looked satisfied, victorious, almost amused. Joshua stared at the image for a long time before placing his phone face down. In that moment, something in him died quietly. Not his love for Jessica. That survived longer than his pride. What died was the part of him that believed people, always recognized the line between survival and surrender. Meanwhile, Jessica entered her new life like a woman stepping into a role she had rehearsed in secret. The mansion was larger than some hotels. The staff spoke carefully around Harold and flatteringly around her. Closets filled, accounts opened. Security followed. Her mother moved into a better neighborhood. Old debts disappeared. Her name entered rooms that previously ignored her existence. And still, late at night, silence sometimes pressed against her chest. Harold was never cruel in the obvious ways. That made him harder to categorize. He was disciplined, observant, and disturbingly patient. He gave Jessica luxuries with one hand and studied her with the other. He rarely asked where she had been. He usually already knew. He did not shower her with desperate affection like weak old men in stories. He watched. He tested. He let her think she was the clever one. That unsettled her more than she admitted. Still, she told herself the end goal remained clear. Stay long enough. Build public legitimacy. Position herself as rightful wife and caregiver. Then exit with a settlement large enough to make every sacrifice worthwhile. She did not yet understand that Harold Whitmore had lived too long among greedy people to miss the scent of ambition in his own house. Nearly 2 years passed before Joshua and Jessica spoke in any real way again. By then, Joshua was no longer the dreamer on the rooftop. But neither was he a completely defeated man. He had rebuilt small parts of himself with discipline, not glory. He worked cases, reviewed development contracts, and quietly helped a neighborhood coalition fight an illegal land seizure. The work did not make him rich, but it made him useful again. Usefulness brought back some dignity. One afternoon, an attorney from Harold Whitmore's extended business circle asked Joshua to consult on a property compliance issue. He almost refused when he heard the client name, but money was tight. His mother needed treatment, and walking away would not change the past. That decision pulled him back into Jessica's orbit. The first time they saw each other again, it happened in Harold's library. Shelves rose to the ceiling. Sunlight cut across old wood and framed dust like memory made visible. Jessica turned from the window and froze. Joshua froze too. For one suspended moment, the years between them looked fragile. Jessica recovered first. She asked whether he was really working there now. Joshua answered that he was consulting, not serving. She looked wounded by the edge in his voice. He looked wounded by the careful perfection in hers. Neither apologized for anything. Neither trusted the silence. But old feeling is dangerous because it remembers its own pathway. Over the following weeks, Joshua's work required multiple visits. Conversations happened. Then confessions almost happened. Jessica began to speak more honestly than she meant to. She admitted Harold never fully slept. She admitted he seemed to know things nobody told him. She admitted she felt trapped in a house, built to flatter and monitor her at the same time. Joshua asked the question that mattered. If you feel trapped, why stay? Jessica did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. Because I did not come this far to leave empty-handed. Joshua closed his eyes for a moment. That sentence told him everything and nothing. He knew then that Jessica was planning something. He just did not yet know how far she intended to go. The divorce idea did not arrive in a single flash. It assembled itself piece by piece inside Jessica's mind. Harold's age made time feel short. His wealth made risk feel worth it. The marriage gave her public standing. His occasional health scares made vulnerability visible. When one of Harold's relatives drunkenly complained at dinner that the family would never let some pretty outsider touch the real inheritance, Jessica smiled politely and remembered every word. That sentence transformed greed into determination. She began quietly meeting with an attorney, recommended by a socialite friend who specialized in discrete wealth separations. They reviewed property law, spousal rights, medical claims, public image strategy, and the pressure points wealthy men hated most. The attorney advised patience. Jessica offered patience. The attorney advised performance. Jessica had been performing all her life. The strategy was simple on paper. Create the impression of emotional neglect. Document coldness. Imply promises made privately and broken publicly. Position herself as the loyal young wife who sacrificed her future for an aging husband only to be isolated and deceived. Then file at the exact moment Harold was physically weak enough to avoid lengthy public conflict. Settlements often happened before scandal. Scandal cost reputations. Reputations cost board seats. Board seats protected family empires. Jessica believed Harold would pay to contain humiliation. 500 million became the whispered target. Though even half that number would have changed generations after her. Joshua discovered parts of the plan accidentally and the rest, because Jessica eventually told him. He was horrified. He said this was not strategy anymore. This was war. Jessica replied that men like Harold had been waging war on vulnerable people forever with better tailoring and cleaner documents. Joshua said becoming ruthless did not make her free. Jessica answered that moral purity was a luxury sold mostly to poor people. Still beneath her certainty, fear kept growing. Not fear of failure, fear that Harold might already know. Which brings us back to the room where everything waited. Jessica stood tall and began the speech she had rehearsed. She said the marriage had become unbearable. She said she felt emotionally abandoned. She said promises had been broken. She said she could no longer remain in a relationship built on control and silence. Her lawyer added polished language about dignity, fairness, and legal remedy. Joshua remained near the desk, officially there for document review, unofficially there because he had a feeling the day would turn ugly. Harold listened without interruption. Not one muscle in his face moved too early. He let Jessica finish. He let the lawyer finish. He let the silence grow heavy enough to become its own witness. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and folded his hands. His eyes rested on Jessica, with the almost gentle focus of a surgeon, about to make the first cut. He said he was not surprised. Jessica tried not to react. Harold said he had expected this conversation much sooner, actually. The lawyer shifted. Joshua's stomach tightened. Harold then turned his eyes to Joshua and said something far stranger. He said, "Joshua," I wondered how long it would take before she brought the only honest man she ever loved back into this house. Jessica's face changed instantly. Joshua took one step back. The room lost air. Harold reached into the top drawer of the desk and removed a slim black remote. He pressed a button. A hidden screen descended from the wall beside the fireplace. Jessica stared as video files appeared one by one. Dates, photos, restaurant footage, call logs, private meetings, attorney visits, copies of financial requests, audio clips, not guesses, evidence, years of it. Harold had not been sleeping in ignorance. He had been watching. Jessica's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her lawyer tried to protest the legality of surveillance. Harold raised a hand and silenced him with one look. Then he said the sentence Jessica would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "You thought you married a dying old man, Jessica, but you married the man who built the trust you were never listed in." The room went still enough to hear fabric shift. Jessica looked at him as though language itself had betrayed her. Harold continued. He explained that the fortune everyone discussed so casually was never hers to touch through divorce. The real inheritance had already been transferred years before the marriage into a charitable urban development trust with one controlling beneficiary, Joshua. Jessica turned so sharply toward Joshua that her chair nearly fell. His face carried the same shock as hers. He had known nothing about this. Harold said he met Joshua's late father decades ago during a land rights battle no newspaper ever properly covered. He said Joshua's father once saved him from signing away black-owned property under political pressure. He said he never forgot loyalty when it came without performance. After Joshua's father died, Harold quietly monitored the son from a distance. He watched his education. He watched his collapse. He watched his refusal to become crooked, even when poverty invited him to. Harold said men like Joshua were rare. Men who lost much and still did not become thieves were rarer still. Jessica shook her head and whispered that this was impossible. Harold did not raise his voice. He said it was not impossible. It was deliberate. Every public assumption had been allowed to grow because false assumptions attract true character. Jessica had not been chosen for love alone. She had been observed, tested, measured, and now answered. Joshua whispered Harold's name, still trying to understand what kind of game had been unfolding around him. Harold finally looked tired. Not weak, not broken. Tired. He said he had one final amendment prepared. If Jessica proceeded with fraudulent claims, every record would go public. If she withdrew the divorce petition quietly, he would allow her to leave the marriage with dignity, a private settlement, and her name intact. But the $500 million she dreamed about, that money was never waiting for her. It was waiting for the man she once left behind. Jessica stood there, beautiful and shattered, her hand still resting on the binder as though the physical object might stop reality from moving. Joshua felt anger, grief, pity, and disbelief colliding inside him. He had wanted justice once. He had imagined Jessica regretting what she did to him. But nothing in his private revenge fantasies ever looked like this. This was not triumph. This was tragedy dressed in expensive clothing. Jessica's eyes filled not with graceful tears, but with the raw humiliation of a person realizing that every move she called intelligent had been anticipated by someone older, colder, and more patient. She looked at Joshua, really looked at him, and in that moment, beneath the pride and fear and ambition, he saw the old Jessica flicker. The girl with a hairbrush microphone, the girl who once believed in being more than beautiful. She asked him softly whether he knew. Joshua answered with equal softness, "No." Harold watched them both like a man seeing the end of a long experiment. Outside, rain began tapping the windows in gentle, uneven rhythms. Inside, nobody moved for several seconds. Jessica finally lifted the divorce papers from the desk. Her fingers trembled. Then she tore them once, then again. Then she let the pieces fall. No one stopped her. Harold exhaled. Joshua closed his eyes. And Jessica understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that the greatest loss in the room was not money. It was the life she might have had if fear had not taught her to. Worship survival more than truth. If you are still here, then this story has already touched something in you. And for that, we sincerely appreciate you. We put a lot of effort into creating stories like this. Stories that are powerful, meaningful, and capable of leaving a lasting impact. So if you believe in this kind of storytelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep sharing more life-changing stories with you. Now, let us return to the story because the next moment is very deep. After the papers fell, the torn divorce papers lay scattered across the polished floor like the remains of a future Jessica had already spent in her mind. Nobody bent down to gather them. Nobody rushed to soften the silence. The room had changed too completely for small gestures to matter. Jessica stood motionless beside the desk, her chest rising and falling, with the fragile rhythm of someone trying not to break in front of witnesses. Joshua remained a few feet away, still unable to reconcile the man. He thought Harold Whitmore was with the man. now sitting quietly behind that enormous desk. Harold looked neither triumphant nor cruel. That unsettled Joshua more than open gloating would have. He looked like a man who had simply waited for a clock to strike. The hour he already knew was coming. Jessica finally found enough breath to speak. Her voice was thin, strained, and stripped of the performance she had worn all morning. She asked Harold how long he had known. Harold answered without hesitation. Long enough to stop believing your smiles. Jessica swallowed hard. She asked whether every gift, every dinner, every public appearance had been part of some test. Harold replied that life itself was the test. People simply reveal themselves when money removes the need to hide. Her lawyer, sensing that the room no longer belonged to legal language, quietly collected his briefcase and asked whether his client wished to continue privately. Jessica did not even look at him. She told him to leave. He left with the alert speed of a man who understood disaster when he smelled it. That left only the three of them. Three people bound together by history, ambition, and wounds nobody in Atlanta society would ever fully understand. Jessica turned toward Joshua again, searching his face for confirmation that he had truly known nothing about the trust. Joshua's expression gave her the truth before he repeated it. He said he had no idea. His father's name had never once been mentioned to him by Harold. No letters, no calls, no meetings, nothing. Harold folded his hands and said that was intentional. Inheritance given too early often destroys the character it claims to reward. Joshua's jaw tightened. He asked Harold whether being secretly observed all these years was supposed to feel like honor. Harold answered that honor and comfort rarely travel together. Jessica almost laughed, but pain caught in her throat before the sound could fully form. It was the bitter laugh of a woman who suddenly understood that, in a room she believed she controlled, she had been the least informed person from the start. Outside, rain pressed harder against the windows. Inside, Jessica's carefully arranged life had begun to collapse in place. She asked for water, but when she lifted the glass, her hand shook too violently to drink. Joshua stepped forward instinctively and steadied it. Their fingers brushed for less than a second. That small contact struck harder than any speech. Both of them felt it. Both of them pretended not to. Jessica set the glass down and stared at the dark, liquid surface as if it might explain where she had lost herself. For years she had trained her face to survive every room. Charm in one room, grace in another. Softness when needed, distance when safer. But this moment was too naked for performance. She looked at Harold and asked the question she had spent years refusing to ask herself. Did you ever love me at all? Harold's answer came slower this time. He said yes, though not in the simple way young people mean when they say the word. He loved her beauty. He loved her discipline. He loved the hunger in her because he recognized it. He loved the part of her that refused to remain where the world first placed her. But he also knew hunger becomes dangerous when it stops remembering what it is feeding on. Jessica blinked, and the tears came before she could stop them. Not graceful tears, not dramatic tears, the humiliating kind that disturb breathing and distort makeup and reveal how much a person has been holding up alone. Joshua had not seen her cry like that since years. Earlier, in a parking lot behind a cheap apartment building, when an eviction notice had arrived with red letters across the envelope. Back then, he had taken her face in both hands and promised they would find a way. He remembered that now with almost physical pain. Jessica wiped her cheeks angrily. She hated crying in front of Harold. She hated crying in front of Joshua even more, because Joshua knew what those tears meant. He knew they did not come from losing luxury. They came from the unbearable realization that the very fear she spent her life trying to outrun had turned her into someone she could barely defend. Harold stood at last, slower than before, but still imposing. He walked to the window and looked out at the rain. Without turning around, he said Jessica had a choice to make before sundown. She could leave quietly, accept the controlled settlement he offered, and protect what remained of her name, or she could fight publicly and discover how brutal society becomes when a young wife is recast from glamour to fraud. Jessica asked what the settlement would be. Harold named a number that was still enormous by ordinary standards, but microscopic beside the 500 million she had imagined. Joshua noticed that she barely reacted to the amount. Money had suddenly moved lower on the list of things she was losing. Jessica left the office first because she needed air she did not have to share with either man. The hallway outside Harold's office was long, lined with portraits and too quiet for a house that large. She walked until her heels slowed, then stopped beside a narrow console table and gripped its edge. Joshua followed after a few seconds, leaving Harold alone with his window and his silence. When Joshua reached her, he did not speak immediately. He remembered too clearly how words can feel like pressure when a person is already drowning. Jessica kept her back turned for a while. Then she said, without looking at him, "This is the part where you should tell me I deserve it." Joshua leaned against the wall and answered with tired honesty, "Maybe a part of me once wanted to." She laughed faintly through the remnants of tears. "And now?" Joshua looked down the hallway, past the family portraits, past the polished wood and inherited power, and said, "Now I just think everybody in that room lost something." Jessica turned then, searching his face. She asked how he could say that when he had just learned that an urban development trust tied to his father. His memory was waiting for him. Joshua replied that money attached to dead people and broken histories never arrives clean. Jessica stared at him, then shook her head slowly. "That is what I hated about you sometimes," she said. "You always found a moral angle even when the world was kicking us in the teeth." Joshua gave the smallest, saddest smile. "And that is what I hated about you sometimes," he answered. "You started calling fear wisdom." Those words might have turned into another argument years earlier. Now they settled between them as confession. Jessica asked whether he had ever really stopped loving her. Joshua looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You do not stop all at once. You stop in pieces." She inhaled shakily. "And are there any pieces left?" He did not respond right away. That silence gave her the answer she feared most. Not no, not yes, something far more painful. Uncertainty. Before either of them could say more, a house attendant appeared at the far end of the hallway and informed Jessica that her car would be prepared whenever she was ready. The formality of it felt like exile wrapped in politeness. Jessica thanked the attendant, then looked back at Joshua with eyes that had lost their earlier sharpness. For the first time in years, she looked less like a strategist and more like a tired woman who had taken the wrong road too long. She whispered that she did not know where to go. Joshua answered softly, "That might be the first honest place to start." Back inside the office, Harold remained by the window after they left. Age made solitude heavier, but he had never learned how to live any other way. He rested one hand on the back of the chair and looked at his reflection in the darkened glass. Behind the wealth, the tailored suits, and the controlled public image, he was still the boy from Macon, who watched his mother scrub rich people's floors and learned that power respected only what it could not easily bend. People in Atlanta called him ruthless because they had only met the finished version of him. They had not met the younger Harold who once trusted partners who smiled too easily. They had not seen the land theft attempts, the predatory contracts, the councilmen who shook hands by day and stole by night. They had not seen the battle that tied his life to Joshua's father. Years ago, when Whitmore Development was still one decisive mistake away from ruin, Joshua's father, Isaiah Bennett, had stood beside him during a property dispute that would have displaced dozens of black families under the language of urban renewal. Isaiah did not have Harold's money. He had something rarer. He could not be bought against his own conscience. That loyalty saved Harold millions and saved the neighborhood even more. When Isaiah died, Harold attended the funeral from a distance and left before anyone noticed him. He told himself distance was cleaner. He told himself he did not owe sentiment to the dead. But guilt is patient. Years later, after quietly learning how Joshua had tried to build affordable housing and how that dream had been destroyed by corruption, Harold saw in the son what he once respected in the father. Integrity under pressure, not perfection, not polish, integrity. So he built the trust. He designed it with lawyers who understood secrecy better than loyalty. He set conditions. He protected it from marriage, manipulation, and political parasites. And yes, he watched, maybe too much, maybe in ways that revealed the same distrust that had poisoned all his relationships. But men like Harold rarely separated caution from affection. Sometimes the two became indistinguishable. He sank into his chair and rubbed one tired hand over his face. Jessica had disappointed him, yet he could not deny that part of him had wanted her to prove him wrong. He had not married her only as an experiment. That would have been a lie. He married her because even in her ambition he glimpsed brilliance. He thought wealth might settle her fear. Instead, it sharpened it. He looked at the torn papers on the floor and thought of how often money promises rescue while secretly amplifying every weakness already in a person's bones. Jessica left the estate just before evening. She did not take much. A handbag, a coat, a phone that now felt heavier than stone. The driver opened the back door of the car, but she asked to sit alone up front. He did not question her. Rain streaked across the windshield as the gates opened and the Whitmore estate disappeared behind iron bars and dark trees. Atlanta moved around her in wet blurs of brake lights, storefront reflections, and people walking under umbrellas toward ordinary lives. Ordinary suddenly looked holy. She watched a young couple hurrying into a diner, laughing as they shielded each other from the rain, and something twisted painfully in her chest. She remembered a different rainy night years ago, when Joshua had wrapped his own jacket around her shoulders because she had forgotten hers after a temp shift. They had been broke, hungry, and completely uncertain about next month. Yet she remembered laughing then with a freedom she had not felt in years. Memory can be cruel in moments of collapse. It does not show random scenes. It selects the exact ones that reveal what you traded away. Her phone buzzed again and again. Friends? A cousin? A socialite who always seemed to know when gossip was near. Jessica turned the phone face down. She was not ready to hear her own life discussed in curious voices. She asked the driver to take her not to her mother's new condo, not to the downtown hotel Harold's assistant had prepared, but to the old neighborhood where she once lived before wealth elevated her, addressed and complicated her soul. The driver glanced at her once, then obeyed. When they reached the block, Jessica stared through the rain-fogged glass at buildings that looked smaller than memory had preserved them. Nothing grand waited there. No chandelier, no silent staff, no marble staircase. Yet the sight of those worn steps and patched railings broke something open inside her. She told the driver to stop. He asked whether she was sure. She said yes, though certainty was the one thing she did not possess. She stood under the awning of a corner store for several minutes after the car left, breathing the smell of rain, fried food, gasoline, and home. Then she realized she had nowhere on that street to actually go. Her old apartment was rented by strangers. Her mother no longer lived nearby. Her old self no longer lived there either. That was when she understood a truth sharper than Harold's threat. She had spent so long escaping her past that she never noticed. She might one day become homeless inside her own story. Joshua did not go home immediately after leaving the estate. He drove to his office downtown, turned on only the lamp by his desk, and sat in the dim room with the black folder Harold's legal team had quietly handed him before he left. The trust documents were inside, so were letters. One from Harold's attorney, two from financial managers, and one old envelope addressed in handwriting that made Joshua stop breathing for a second. His father's. Joshua stared at it for a long time before opening it. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. The letter was dated years earlier, likely written when Isaiah Bennett already knew his health was failing. Joshua read slowly. His father wrote about land, dignity, and the cost of trying to build something, honest in a system that profits from compromise. He wrote that money is useful but dangerous when it becomes a substitute for purpose. He wrote that he had once met a hard man named Harold Whitmore, who, despite his flaws, still understood that black wealth without community responsibility was just another version of vanity. Then came the line that hit hardest. If a day comes when someone places power in your hands, do not ask first what it can buy for you. Ask what it can repair beyond you. Joshua lowered the paper and leaned back in his chair. The office felt too small for what he was carrying. His entire adult life had been shaped by scarcity, disappointment, and the long humiliation of unfulfilled promise. Now in a single day, he had been named to a trust large enough to restore his abandoned dream. Affordable housing, community ownership, parks, libraries, legal protections against predatory redevelopment. All the things he once scribbled in notebooks before despair taught him to stop writing them down. Yet beneath the possibility lived another question. Why him? Why now? Why through this house, this marriage, this wreckage? His phone lit up with Jessica's name. He stared at it until it nearly stopped ringing. Then he answered. For a second, neither spoke. Then Jessica said in a voice scraped raw by the day, I do not know who else to call. Joshua closed his eyes. Some rescues arrive dressed like temptations. Some old loves return not because they have become safe, but because pain makes them familiar. Jessica had checked into a modest motel off the interstate under her maiden name. The room was clean enough, but anonymity has its own kind of ache when you have recently lived among chandeliers. Joshua arrived 20 minutes later, carrying takeout from a late-night diner. Neither of them felt hungry enough to appreciate. When Jessica opened the door, she looked smaller somehow. Not physically, spiritually. The polished image the city knew had been stripped away by tears, rain, and exhaustion. Her hair was slightly undone. Her face had the quiet wreckage of a woman, whose reflection no longer matched her story. Joshua stepped inside. The room smelled of soap, stale air conditioning, and French fries. Jessica almost apologized for the place, then stopped herself because the instinct itself felt absurd. Joshua set the food down and asked if she had eaten. She shook her head. He opened the bag anyway. Old habits survive where romance does not. For a while they sat in silence, the television off, the neon sign outside blinking weak red light through the curtains. Then Jessica asked to see the trust documents. Joshua hesitated before handing them over. She read enough to confirm the truth, then set them down with careful hands. "So it really is you," she said. Joshua answered that the trust was not a check with his name on it. It was work, responsibility, oversight, a burden if he accepted it correctly. Jessica gave him a tired look. "Only you could make that sound heavier than blessing." Joshua replied that blessings usually become heavier once you understand what they demand. She looked away. Then came the apology neither of them had prepared for. Jessica said she was sorry for how she left, sorry for mocking his struggle, sorry for choosing security in a form that poisoned everything it touched, sorry for every time she made him feel like being decent was the same as being weak. Joshua listened without interruption. Apologies matter, but timing changes their shape. An apology after collapse can sound like regret for consequences, rather than regret for choices. Jessica knew that too. That was why she did not ask for immediate forgiveness. She only told the truth as plainly as she could. "I was terrified, Joshua, not of being poor for 1 month, of being poor forever, of waking up at 40 with nothing but memories of almost. And I let that terror decide who I became." Joshua sat with that for a while before answering. "Fear explains a lot. It does not excuse everything." Jessica nodded. "I know." Then she asked the question she had been circling all evening. "Do you think there is any way back for someone like me?" Joshua looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the glamorous wife from magazine photos, nor the calculating woman from Harold's office, but a deeply flawed human being standing in the ruins of her own design. He answered carefully, "There is always a way back, but it is never a way back to who you were before. It is a way forward through what you have done." Jessica lowered her head and cried quietly, not because the words were cruel, but because they were honest. What neither of them knew was that trouble had already begun moving in the dark. Harold had kept the day private for now, but privacy is fragile around wealth. Someone in the office had talked. A driver had seen too much. A lawyer's assistant had recognized the tension and texted a friend in media. By the time Joshua left the motel close to midnight, a small entertainment blog had already posted a vague item about possible cracks in the Whitmore. Marriage. No names yet. No proof. Just suggestion. Suggestion was enough. Jessica did not sleep that night. She lay awake in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling while the air conditioner hummed and trucks moved. Along the interstate beyond the wall, every few minutes she imagined footsteps outside the room. She imagined reporters. She imagined Harold changing his mind. She imagined her mother seeing headlines before hearing the truth. She imagined Joshua reading public comments from strangers who would call her every name except human. Sometime near dawn, she sat up and realized she had spent years planning how to win and almost no time considering how to survive defeat. That realization was its own kind of education. When morning finally pushed pale light through the curtains, she had made one decision. Whatever happened next, she would not run again. Not from the marriage. Not from the scandal. Not from the truth. For the first time in a very long time, she chose not strategy but reckoning. Joshua woke to 12 missed calls. Most were from numbers he did not recognize. 2 were from colleagues. 1 was from his mother. His stomach sank before he even opened the first message. A larger local blog had published names. Not all the facts, not even the correct facts, but enough. Whitmore wife reportedly seeks exit amid fortune fight. The headline was designed to travel faster than truth ever could. By 8:30, radio hosts were speculating. By 9, social media had done what it always does with a beautiful woman and a rich old man. It reduced complexity to mockery, gold digger jokes, cruel comments, predictions, memes. Joshua called Jessica immediately. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was calmer than he expected. She had seen it already. He asked if she was alone. She said yes. He told her not to leave the room until they decided the next move. She almost smiled at the irony in his tone. He sounded like the version of himself she once trusted with everything. Joshua then called Harold's office. No answer from Harold directly. Only a terse message from his chief counsel saying the leak did not come from their side and that Mr. Whitmore was handling the matter. Joshua hated that phrase immediately. When wealthy men said they were handling a matter, ordinary people usually paid the emotional cost. He drove toward Jessica's motel with dread gathering steadily in his chest. He did not yet know that before noon, a second story would hit. And this one would not merely embarrass Jessica, it would connect Joshua's name to hers in a way that threatened to drag all three of them into open war. Joshua arrived just as Jessica opened the motel room door with a phone in her hand and pure disbelief on her face. She stepped aside so he could enter, then showed him the screen without a word. The second article was shorter, nastier, and far more dangerous. Secret affair rumors surround Whitmore separation. Below it sat a blurred photo of Jessica and Joshua in the hallway at Harold's estate from the day before. The angle made them appear intimate, conspiratorial, guilty. Joshua felt heat rise through him so fast it nearly shook his hands. Jessica sat heavily on the bed as if her knees had given way. "This is how it begins," she whispered. Joshua looked at the article again, then at her. "No, this is how somebody wants it to begin." There is a difference. But even as he said it, he knew the distinction would mean little to public eyes hungry for scandal. Jessica covered her mouth and tried to steady herself. She said Harold would think she leaked it to create sympathy. Joshua said maybe, or maybe Harold would understand exactly how these circles operate. Neither option comforted her. She looked up at Joshua with a fear more honest than anything he had seen in years. "What if this ruins you too?" Joshua stared at the headline, then out the window, where daylight had fully arrived without bringing any clarity. And for the first time since the trust was revealed, he saw the scale of what was coming. This was not just about a failed marriage anymore. It was about reputation, inheritance, class, old loyalty, black wealth, public image, and the dangerous history between a woman who chose survival over love and a man who never fully stopped carrying her ghost. Joshua placed the phone face down on the table. Then he said the words that turned fear into motion. "We are done reacting. Now we find out who is pushing this and why." Jessica looked at him through the wreckage of the last 24 hours. Something in his voice sounded familiar. Not the defeated man she left, not the cautious consultant from Harold's hallway. This was the old Joshua again. The one who used to stand on rooftops and speak like cities could still be redeemed. Only now he carried scars in the places where certainty used to live, and that made him more dangerous than before. By noon, Atlanta had already chosen the easier story. Not the true one, not the complicated one. The easier one. A beautiful young wife, an aging billionaire, a rumored affair, a hidden fortune, a coming divorce. It was the kind of scandal people consume with moral outrage in public and delighted fascination in private. Radio hosts turned it into performance. Bloggers turned it into sport. Social media turned it into cruelty. Nobody cared that truth was still gasping somewhere under the noise. Jessica sat in the motel chair with her arms wrapped around herself while Joshua paced near the window. Phone in hand, making call after call. Every conversation made the same thing clearer. The story was spreading too fast to be random. This was not ordinary gossip traveling through idle mouths. Somebody was pushing. Somebody with timing. Somebody with access. Jessica asked who would benefit. Joshua stopped pacing and looked at her. There were too many answers. Harold's relatives who resented her. Business rivals who wanted Whitmore weak. Media parasites who lived on humiliation. Even lawyers who preferred conflict over settlement. Jessica lowered her eyes. Or somebody who hates me enough to enjoy watching me fall. Joshua did not dismiss it. Pain leaves footprints in more places than love ever does. He finally reached one of his old contacts in local media, a woman named Denise Carter, who had spent 15 years investigating city corruption and knew exactly how society scandals often hid financial motives. Underneath romantic headlines, Denise agreed to meet, but only in person. No calls, no texts, no trust on open lines. She named a cafe on the west side and hung up before Joshua could ask anything else. Jessica rose slowly from the chair. She said she was coming too. Joshua hesitated. The last thing they needed was for her face to be seen in public. But Jessica shook her head. No more hiding in rooms while other people write my story. Joshua studied her for a second, then nodded. Pain had sharpened her voice in a different direction now. Not toward manipulation, toward reckoning. That did not make her safe. It made her ready. And sometimes readiness is the more dangerous thing. At the Whitmore estate, Harold was not alone for long. By early afternoon, his nephew Marcus Whitmore arrived without invitation. Wearing sympathy on his face and calculation in his eyes, Marcus was 42, polished, expensive, and perpetually offended that family wealth had never flowed through him in the quantities he considered proper. He entered Harold's study speaking too carefully, which always meant he had already rehearsed his position in the car. He said he was concerned. He said the family name was under attack. He said action needed to be swift. Harold remained seated and let Marcus perform concern until the younger man ran out of elegant phrases. Then Harold asked the only question that mattered. Who tipped the blogs? Marcus looked offended with such speed that it nearly qualified as confession. He denied any involvement. He condemned the press. He condemned Jessica. He condemned modern women, modern greed, modern marriage, and nearly everything except himself. Harold listened in silence, then said something that drained the polish from Marcus's face. You are always most articulate when money is frightened. Marcus straightened. He reminded Harold that the family had a right to protect its interests. Harold corrected him. No, the family has a habit of confusing greed with stewardship. Marcus's voice cooled. Then perhaps you should not have married a woman half your age and turned private foolishness into public spectacle. For the first time that day, Harold's expression hardened visibly. He told Marcus to leave. Marcus did not move. Instead, he said he had heard a troubling rumor that Harold's core inheritance had been redirected into structures the family had not approved. That, more than anything else, revealed the real purpose of the visit. He was fishing, not for truth, for confirmation. Harold rose slowly and with enough force in his presence to make Marcus step back at last. He said one sentence so quietly it made the room colder. If you ever confuse being my blood with being entitled to my judgment, you will learn how little the first protects you from the second. Marcus left, but not before Harold saw the fury behind his carefully schooled face. It was the fury of a man who had just discovered that the story might be bigger than a disgraceful marriage. It might be an inheritance war, and Harold knew Marcus well enough to understand one dangerous fact. Men who feel cheated become reckless faster than men who were never promised anything at all. The cafe Denise chose was small, brick-walled, half-empty, and the kind of place where conversations blended into grinder noise and steaming milk. Joshua arrived first and checked the room before. Jessica entered through the side door in oversized sunglasses and a plain coat that did little to hide the tension in her body. Denise was already seated in the back corner with a laptop closed in front of her and a face that did not waste time, pretending life was softer than it was. She looked at Jessica once, then at Joshua. You did not say she was coming. Joshua answered that she had a right to hear anything said about her life. Denise replied that rights and safety were different things, but she let it go. She leaned forward and got straight to it. The first leak was amateur. The second was not. The second headline came from someone who understood exactly what kind of angle would ignite public appetite fastest. Romance, betrayal, money. Denise said the blurred hallway photo was especially telling. That image did not come from a random bystander. It came from estate security or someone close enough to obtain it through staff. Jessica went still. Joshua asked if Denise could trace where the stories originated. She said origin points online are rarely clean, but she had found signs of coordination, similar language in multiple outlets, shared metadata patterns, anonymous tips arriving within minutes of each other, enough to suggest a push campaign rather than spontaneous gossip. Jessica asked the question she had been carrying all day. Do you think Harold did it? Denise did not answer immediately. She studied Jessica the way reporters study both words and silence. Then she said Harold Whitmore protects reputation like property. If he wanted you destroyed, he would probably do it more elegantly than this. Joshua felt the truth of that immediately. Harold could be cold, but this smelled messy, emotional. Hungry, Denise tapped one finger against the table and added that another name kept floating near the edges of her inquiry. Marcus Whitmore. Jessica exhaled sharply. Joshua asked why Marcus. Denise said because Marcus had recently made several unusual calls to a crisis communications firm he did not officially retain, and because one of the blogs that pushed the second story had previously killed an item involving a real estate board member after pressure from a source connected to Marcus's circle. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to make the air change. Jessica stared at the coffee she had not touched. Marcus always hated me, she said quietly. Joshua asked whether Marcus knew anything about the trust. Jessica said she did not think so. Then Denise delivered the sentence that turned suspicion into urgency. If he does not know yet, this scandal may be how he plans to smoke it out. Memory returned to Jessica in fragments as Denise spoke. Marcus at dinners, smiling too politely. Marcus at charity events, introducing her with just enough sarcasm hidden. Inside charm to leave a bruise no one else could see. Marcus once saying, with a glass in his hand and family members nearby, that outsiders always think marriage is the fastest route into legacy. At the time, Jessica had smiled back and answered something equally polished, but she had never forgotten the contempt in his eyes. He did not merely dislike her. He resented what she represented. Youth entering old money, beauty stepping into lineage, an uncontrolled variable inside, a family that believed blood and wealth should circle only familiar names. Jessica realized now that Marcus may have been watching her almost as closely as Harold had. The difference was motive. Harold watched to measure. Marcus likely watched to weaponize. She told Denise about a conversation from months earlier after. Harold suffered a brief health scare. Marcus had cornered her near the back terrace during a family dinner and asked, too casually, whether Harold had updated any major structures recently. Jessica pretended not to understand. Marcus smiled and said he only meant legal matters, trusts, holdings, protections. The details old men become obsessed with when they begin counting sunsets. At the time, Jessica thought he was simply fishing for family gossip. Now it looked different. Denise wrote it down. Joshua asked if there was enough to publish yet. Denise almost smiled. You do not publish war based on instinct and wounded memory, she said. You publish when the paper can survive the counterattack. Joshua leaned back, frustrated but respectful. Denise was right. People with Whitmore money did not merely threaten lawsuits. They suffocated stories at the source. Jessica asked what they were supposed to do in the meantime. Denise answered with a hard journalist's practicality. Find proof before whoever is moving this decides to move faster. Joshua looked at Jessica. Jessica looked at Joshua. The answer sat between them before either spoke it aloud. They needed access to the estate again, and that meant returning to the very house where everything had already begun falling apart. Before anything else, Joshua drove to see his mother. There are some storms a man cannot let his family learn from strangers. Mrs. Loretta Bennett lived in a modest brick house with flower pots on the porch and a Bible on the table permanently open to some page of endurance. She already knew enough from headlines to be wounded, and not enough from truth to be at peace. When Joshua arrived, she did not greet him with panic. She greeted him with that maternal stillness which is often more frightening than anger. She sat him at the kitchen table and asked plainly whether he was in trouble. Joshua told her no, not yet, though the answer felt unstable. Then he explained everything he could without burying her under details. Harold, the marriage, the trust, the letter from Isaiah, Jessica's collapse, the scandal, the possible leak. His mother listened with her hands folded in her lap and sorrow deepening around her eyes whenever Jessica's name arose. When he finished, she remained quiet for a long moment. Then she said the one thing he had not let himself say aloud. This is your father's shadow returning through another man's wealth. Joshua rubbed a hand over his face. He said he did not know whether to accept the trust or reject the entire mess. Loretta Bennett shook her head softly. Baby, do not reject purpose just because chaos carried it to your door. Joshua looked at her, exhausted. She continued, "Your father always said God can send clean assignments through dirty circumstances. The dirt does not cancel the assignment. It only tests whether you can carry it without becoming stained by it." Joshua almost smiled despite himself. Only his mother could make a sentence like that feel both holy and practical. Then her voice softened even more. "And Jessica?" He lowered his eyes. Loretta sighed. She said she had loved Jessica once because Jessica laughed with her whole spirit and used to help, wash dishes without being asked. Then she said she had grieved Jessica later, not because the girl chose money, but because she chose fear, as if fear were wiser than love. Joshua asked whether he was foolish to still care. Loretta answered with painful tenderness. "No, but caring and returning are not the same thing. Be careful not to confuse the two." He carried those words with him when he left. He would need them sooner than he knew. Jessica had delayed calling her mother all day, because shame is often heavier with the people who know your first name before the world learns your polished one. When she finally arrived at the condo Harold had helped purchase for Mrs. Monroe, the late afternoon sun had turned the parking lot gold in a way that felt almost mocking. Her mother opened the door before Jessica could knock twice. She had already seen enough online to know something terrible was unfolding, yet she said nothing at first. She simply pulled Jessica into her arms. That nearly undid Jessica more than the headlines had. Inside, the condo was neat, carefully decorated, and still carried traces of her mother's older life in the framed church programs and crocheted pillows that wealth had not replaced. Jessica sat on the couch and tried to explain, but explanation sounded pathetic in pieces. "I messed up. I thought I could control it. I thought I was being smart." Her mother listened, then asked a devastatingly simple question. "Were you ever happy?" Jessica opened her mouth and closed it again. That silence answered more than words could. Mrs. Monroe nodded slowly, as if some private suspicion had just been confirmed. She said she had known Jessica was comfortable, admired, and dressed well, but she had never once been convinced Jessica was at peace. Jessica asked whether her mother was ashamed of her. Mrs. Monroe answered with tears in her own eyes. "I am sad for you. Ashamed is too small a word for what mothers feel." Jessica broke then. Completely. She cried into her mother's lap with the helplessness of childhood, while evening light moved across the room and touched the expensive furniture purchased from a marriage now rotting in public view. When the storm of tears finally eased, her mother stroked her hair and said something Jessica did not expect. "If you have done wrong, then stand in it. Do not decorate it. Do not excuse it. And do not let rich people make you the only sinner in a room full of greed." Jessica looked up through swollen eyes. Her mother rarely spoke with such hard clarity. But there it was, a map, not toward comfort, toward honesty. Jessica nodded slowly. She said she thought Marcus Whitmore might be behind the leaks. Her mother's face tightened at the name. She remembered Marcus from family dinners. "Too smooth," she said immediately. "Men like that smile like they already forgave you for something you did not do." Jessica almost laughed through the wreckage. The line was so accurate it hurt. By evening, Joshua had arranged what should have been impossible: a brief return to the Whitmore estate. Harold had agreed, though not warmly. The message sent through counsel was concise. 1 hour. No dramatics. No games. Jessica and Joshua drove together in tense silence, the city dimming around them as estate neighborhoods grew larger, quieter, and more guarded. When the gates opened, Jessica felt her pulse trip in her throat. Coming back so soon felt like stepping into the side of her own emotional crime. But there was no room left for comfort. Inside, Harold received them in the library rather than the office. That choice alone signaled something. The library carried less battlefield energy and more memory. Harold listened as Joshua explained Denise's concerns and the possibility that Marcus was using the scandal to provoke movement around the inheritance. Harold's face did not shift much, but a small muscle near his jaw tightened when Marcus's name entered the air. Jessica watched that detail closely. It told her more than a louder reaction would have. Harold said he had suspected Marcus might do something reckless once public whispers began. Joshua asked whether security, footage and staff records from the estate could verify if anyone accessed the hallway image. Harold said yes, but not without consequence. If Marcus was involved, proof would split the family more openly than any private feud before it. Jessica answered with quiet steel. The family already split itself the moment somebody decided to use me as bait. Harold's eyes met hers then, and for the first time since the collapse in his office, he seemed to see not simply her ambition, but her humiliation. It did not erase what she had done, but it shifted the temperature between them by a degree. Harold instructed his head of security to produce internal access logs, footage requests, and device records tied to the study hallway cameras. While they waited, silence settled again. Finally, Harold spoke to Joshua. "Your father would have hated all of this," Joshua answered dryly. "That makes two of us." A faint, almost unwilling curve touched Harold's mouth before disappearing. Even in crisis, some men only know how to exchange respect through restraint. The security review took longer than anyone wanted. Jessica wandered the shelves of the library, trailing one finger along old spines she had never actually read during her marriage. Luxury often places knowledge in the room only as furniture. Joshua stood near the mantel, arms folded, thinking 3 moves ahead and none of them clearly. Then the head of security entered with a tablet, a folder, and a face carefully schooled into neutrality. The hallway footage had indeed been accessed the night before the second leak. Not by Harold, not by official counsel, by an internal administrator using elevated permissions authorized from Marcus. Whitmore's assistant's account. Joshua felt a surge of vindication followed immediately by dread. Marcus had not merely gossiped. He had penetrated house systems. Harold asked whether the access was direct or delegated. The answer came back worse than expected. Both. The assistant account initiated it. Then an external copy was made to a removable device signed out earlier that week under Marcus's own office authorization. Jessica sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs because her legs suddenly felt unreliable again. This was no accident. No rumor casually passed over drinks. It was an operation. Harold took the folder and read the summary in silence. When he looked up, age had not made him smaller. It had made him colder. Joshua asked what the next move was. Harold said there were 2. One private, one public. Privately, Marcus would be confronted immediately. Publicly, the family could still choose whether to expose his role or manage the scandal in another direction. Jessica asked why there was still a question. If Marcus did this, why protect him? Harold's answer landed heavily. Because families built on power often prefer internal rot to public embarrassment. Jessica held his gaze. That is how rot survives. The line hung in the library with sharp truth. Joshua saw Harold absorb it. He did not like being spoken to that way, but neither could he deny its accuracy. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the evidence itself, voices rose in the front hall. A man's voice, angry, entitled. Marcus had arrived. He entered the library before anyone formally allowed him in. That was Marcus's style. He believed doors opened faster when invaded with confidence. He stopped only when he saw Jessica, Joshua, Harold, and the head of security all in one room. For half a second, surprise flashed across his face. Then composure returned, polished and poisonous. "Well, this is intimate," he said. Harold did not invite him to sit. He held up the folder instead. "Would you like to explain why my internal security records carry your fingerprints all over yesterday's leak?" Marcus blinked once. Then his expression shifted into offended disbelief. He denied it instantly. He called the accusation absurd. He said perhaps Jessica was trying to redirect attention from her own recklessness. Jessica rose from the chair before Joshua could stop her. "No, Marcus," she said, voice steady with a force even she had not known she still possessed. "You do not get to use me as the family trash. Fire and then pretend your hands are clean." Marcus laughed softly, but the sound had cracks in it now. He looked at Harold and said this was exactly what happened when outsiders were brought too close. They manipulated. They divided. They embarrassed. Joshua stepped forward then, not loudly, but with enough contained anger to alter the room. "Say, outsider. One more time, like you own the bloodline of Black. Struggle that built this family's money." Marcus turned toward him with visible contempt. "And who are you supposed to be now?" "The new conscience of the empire." The line hit closer than Marcus intended. Harold answered before Joshua could. "He is the man you should have worried about long before you mistook inheritance for entitlement." Marcus froze, not because he fully understood, because he understood enough. His eyes moved from Harold to Joshua, then back again, and in that instant, The suspicion he had been chasing finally found shape. "You moved it," he said quietly. Harold did not deny it. Marcus's face changed completely. The mask of family concern shattered, revealing the raw greed underneath. "You moved it to him." Silence. That was confirmation enough. Marcus took a step back as if the room itself had betrayed him. Then fury flooded in. Years of expectation, years of imagined succession, years of polished waiting, all collapsing at once. Marcus stopped pretending after that. He said Joshua was nothing, a failed dreamer, a nobody with sentimental value. He said Harold had gone senile and romantic. He said no outsider, no matter how noble the story sounded, had the right to sit over Whitmore legacy. Joshua almost answered, but Harold lifted one hand and quieted him. Then Harold delivered the blow cleanly. "Whitmore legacy," he said, "is precisely why you were never fit to hold it." Marcus's breathing changed. He looked not embarrassed now, but dangerous. Men who have just lost imagined. Wealth often resemble gamblers at the exact moment reason leaves the table. He admitted enough in his anger to remove all doubt. Yes, he had pushed the story. Yes, he wanted the city talking. Yes, he wanted pressure, because pressure reveals where old men hide papers and who they panic to protect. He pointed at Jessica. She was bait, he said openly. A convenient one. Young, visible, easy for the public to despise. Jessica did not flinch. The cruelty still landed, but she did not flinch. Marcus turned on Joshua next. "And now look at you," he sneered, "still circling the woman who threw you away, hoping morality will somehow make you worthy of what money finally did." Joshua stepped close enough for the air between them to tighten. "Do not confuse restraint with weakness," he said. Marcus smirked, but it wavered. Harold then did what no one expected. He ordered security to call counsel, preserve every record, and initiate action against Marcus immediately. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "You would do this to family?" Harold's answer came like stone. "You already did." Security moved. Marcus backed toward the doorway, his face full of hatred now stripped of polish. Before leaving, he looked at Jessica with one final poisoned expression and said, "This city will never let you recover from this." Then to Joshua, he added, "And if you think they will ever let you hold that money in peace, you are stupider than you look." He left with the force of a man already planning his next act of damage. The library fell silent again, but this silence was different. The hidden war had finally spoken its own name. Jessica stared at the doorway long after Marcus disappeared. Then she said almost to herself, "He was never after me. I was just the easiest fire to start." Joshua looked at her. That may have been true, but being used as kindling still burns. After Marcus left, nobody felt victorious. Proof had come. So had clarity. But clarity is expensive when it arrives inside families, fortunes, and unfinished love. Harold dismissed security and remained in the library with Jessica and Joshua as twilight deepened outside the windows. He told them the public narrative would shift soon, but not cleanly. Once stories start feeding on scandal, correction rarely travels with the same energy as accusation. Jessica asked if he intended to release Marcus's role publicly. Harold said yes, but carefully. Not as family spectacle, as unauthorized misuse of security material and malicious media interference. Joshua asked what that meant for the trust. Harold answered that legal protections were solid, but public pressure would come. Board members would question. Political figures would distance themselves. Men who had always smiled at Harold's table would suddenly rediscover moral language. Joshua nodded grimly. So Marcus was right about one thing. There will be no peace around this money. Harold looked at him with something close to reluctant respect. Peace was never the point. Responsibility was. Jessica listened to both men and felt with painful clarity how much of life she had misunderstood. She once thought security meant comfort. Now she saw that real power often meant burden, conflict, and lonely decisions nobody applauded. The revelation did not make Harold innocent. It did not make Joshua invincible. It did, however, expose the childishness of the fantasy she had been chasing. She rose and said she should leave. Harold surprised her by asking where she would go. She answered that she did not know yet. Then Harold said something that made both her and Joshua turn. "Stay in the guest wing tonight, under security. No press. No motel. No running." Jessica stared at him, unsure whether the offer was mercy, strategy, or both. Harold added that whatever she had done, Marcus had now turned her into collateral in a fight bigger than her private failure. He would not have blood on his property or her public ruin accelerated by his silence. Joshua watched Jessica wrestle with the offer. Pride told her to refuse. Exhaustion told her to accept. Truth told her she was no longer in a position to survive on image alone. At last, she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Harold did not answer with sentiment. He simply turned toward the window and looked out into the dark. Joshua saw then that old men, like cities, can carry both cruelty and protection in the same architecture. The trouble is that you often do not know which room you are standing in until the door locks behind you. Jessica spent the night in the guest wing of the Whitmore estate, but sleep never truly came. The room was elegant, quiet, and safer than the motel, yet safety felt different now. It no longer felt like luxury. It felt like a pause before the next blow. She sat by the window in a cream robe, watching the dark grounds stretch beyond the glass, and realized how strange it was that the same house she once used as a ladder now felt like a witness. Every hallway carried memory. Every polished table reflected choices she could no longer explain away. For the first time in years, Jessica stopped asking how to recover her image. She asked a harder question. Who am I when there is nothing left to perform? Down the hall, Joshua remained in another room, unable to leave while Marcus was still angry and unpredictable. Harold had insisted on it. No arguments, no pride, no unnecessary risks. So the three of them stayed under one roof again, not as husband, former lover, and old patriarch, but as people trapped inside the consequences of power, fear, and family war. Near midnight, Jessica stepped into the hallway and found Joshua standing near the balcony doors, looking out into the dark. For a second, neither spoke. Then Jessica asked if he ever imagined they would end up here. Joshua gave a tired smile. Not like this. Never like this. She moved closer, but not too close. There was too much history between them for careless distance. Jessica told him she had been thinking about the girl she used to be. The one who believed she would become a journalist. The one who used to laugh at almost nothing. Joshua said he remembered her. Jessica lowered her eyes. I do not think I do. That answer sat heavily between them. Joshua turned toward her and said something gentle enough to hurt. People do not always disappear completely. Sometimes they get buried under choices they were too afraid to question. Jessica looked at him then, and in that moment, all the polished armor she used to wear around him was gone. She said she was sorry again, but this time not like before. Not as a fallen woman apologizing because life punished her. This sounded quieter, truer. I did not just leave you, Joshua. I betrayed the part of myself that loved what was good in you. Joshua exhaled slowly. He did not rush to comfort her. He did not weaponize her regret either. He only said, I know. And somehow those two words carried more sorrow than anger ever could. The next morning, Harold asked them both to meet him in the breakfast room. No lawyers, no staff lingering nearby, just the three of them and sunlight, pushing through tall windows as though the world outside had not been feeding on their names for 2 days. Harold looked older in morning light, not weaker, just less protected by shadow. He told them he had already begun legal action against Marcus. The security breach would be documented, the leak trail would be pursued, and a statement would be prepared. Joshua nodded. But Jessica asked the question that had been burning in her since the night before. Why are you helping me now? Harold looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because you are guilty of many things, but not of being the architect of this final attack. He paused, then added, and because I have spent enough of my life confusing discipline with mercilessness. Jessica did not expect that from him. Neither did Joshua. Harold continued. He said he had built his life by assuming betrayal was always near. Sometimes he had been right. Sometimes he had destroyed softness before it had a chance to prove itself. He admitted that even in marriage, he had watched Jessica more than he trusted her. That did not excuse her motives. But it also did not make him innocent. The room went still. Harold Whitmore was not a man who confessed easily, so when he did, every word landed heavily. He looked at Joshua next. Then he said something that changed the morning completely. There may come a day soon when this trust, this family war, and this city become too heavy for me to manage directly. When that day comes, you will have to decide whether you are willing to carry more than money. You will have to carry enemies. Joshua held his gaze and answered without hesitation. Then I would rather carry enemies for something meaningful than live safely for nothing. By midday, the public story had shifted. A formal legal notice tied to unauthorized. Media leaks reached enough reporters to force a new angle. Marcus's name was not yet fully exposed. But insiders were already whispering that the scandal had been manipulated from within the Whitmore family itself. Jessica sat in the sitting room reading the updated coverage on a tablet, and for the first time since the story broke, she was not being painted as the sole villain. But relief did not come, only exhaustion, because partial public sympathy could not undo private truth. No headline could rewrite why she had married Harold. No correction could erase what fear had turned her into. Joshua entered and found her staring at the screen without really seeing it. He asked if the shift helped at all. Jessica gave a faint, sad shake of her head. A little, but not in the places that matter. Joshua sat across from her. Then Jessica asked the question she had been avoiding since the scandal started. If none of this had happened, if Harold had never exposed me, would you still have hated me forever? Joshua did not answer quickly. Forever is a long time, he said at last. Jessica almost smiled through the sadness. That is not an answer. No, he said. It is the most honest one I have, because some part of me always hoped you would wake up before life forced you to. Jessica looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tablet. Life forced me to. Joshua nodded once. Yes, it did. That evening, just when the house had finally become quiet enough to breathe, Harold received a call that tightened the entire atmosphere again. Marcus had not disappeared into shame. He had gone in the opposite direction. He was threatening to challenge the trust publicly, question Harold's competence, and pull private family history into court if necessary. Joshua listened in silence as Harold ended the call and placed the phone down with deliberate calm. Jessica could see it in Harold's eyes immediately. The war was not cooling. It was widening. Harold looked at Joshua and said, "He wants me declared unstable." Joshua's jaw hardened. "Because of the trust." Harold nodded. Jessica spoke before she could stop herself. "Then he is not just fighting for money. He is fighting to humiliate you into surrender." Harold gave her a sharp look, then a slow one. "Yes," he said. "Now you understand this family." Joshua stepped toward the window, mind moving quickly. "If Marcus pushes this into open court, every rumor gets dragged into the light." Jessica lowered her voice. "Including me." Joshua turned back toward her. "Including all of us." The truth settled in. This was no longer a scandal to outlast. It was a battle that would force each of them to choose exactly who they were willing to become under pressure. And for Jessica, that choice was finally clear. She looked at Harold, then at Joshua, and said with a steadiness neither man had heard from her before, "If Marcus wants to use me as the weapon that opens this house, then I will be the witness that closes it on him instead." Joshua looked at her carefully. Not as the woman who once abandoned him, not as the woman headlines had mocked, but as someone who might finally be stepping into truth without using it as decoration. Harold held her gaze a moment longer, then gave one short nod. "Good," he said, "because tomorrow we begin answering him properly." The next morning did not feel dramatic. It felt sharp, clean, final. That was somehow worse. Sunlight touched the Whitmore estate like nothing inside it had changed. Yet every person under that roof knew the day would decide more than reputation. It would decide legacy. Harold sat in the private conference room with counsel beside him, Joshua across from him, and Jessica at the far end of the table, calm in a way she had never been when she was still trying to win. Marcus arrived late, carrying the confidence of a man who still believed noise could overpower truth. He threatened court. He threatened family exposure. He threatened medical competency review. He threatened the board. Then Harold's counsel placed the evidence in front of him. Security records, access logs, internal authorizations, media contact trails, time-stamped transfers. The room changed instantly. Marcus read just enough to understand that denial would no longer save him. His confidence broke first in the eyes, then in the mouth. He looked at Harold with disbelief, then at Joshua with naked hatred. But before he could reshape the room with another lie, Jessica spoke. Quietly, clearly, without performance. She admitted her own motives in the marriage. She admitted her divorce plan. She admitted her greed, her fear, and the shame of what she had become. Then she said Marcus had taken a guilty woman and tried to turn her into a weapon for a larger theft. That truth landed harder because it came from her. Not polished, not rehearsed, just true. Marcus tried one final time to twist the room. He said Jessica's confession proved the family had been infiltrated. He said Joshua was still an outsider. He said Harold had lost perspective. Harold stood before he could finish. Age did not weaken the authority in him. It sharpened it. He told Marcus that blood without character was only biology, and inheritance without stewardship was only appetite wearing a suit. Then he removed Marcus from every active family structure that still carried his signature. No more internal access, no more board support, no more discretionary authority. The trust would stand. Joshua would remain its controlling beneficiary. And if Marcus pursued public destruction, Harold would answer publicly in full. For the first time, Marcus understood he had not been arguing with a man afraid of scandal. He had been arguing with a man finally willing to outlive it. Marcus left the room in silence. Not humbled, men like him rarely become humble that quickly, but defeated enough to know the door had shut. After Marcus left, the room felt lighter but not joyful. Too much had been exposed for joy to arrive so simply. Harold turned to Jessica and said the settlement offer still stood if she wanted to leave quietly. Jessica looked at the papers, then pushed them back across the table. No, she said. For the first time in this whole story, she wanted nothing she had not earned. She would leave the marriage with her name, her truth, and whatever dignity honesty could still preserve. No strategic payout, no polished victimhood, no hidden bargain. Joshua looked at her then with something gentler than forgiveness, but deeper than pity, respect. Not full restoration, not yet, but respect. Harold studied her for a long second and gave a single nod. Then leave cleanly, he said, and do not waste what this pain has taught you. Jessica accepted that more deeply than any money he could have offered. Because for the first time, she understood that the life she needed to rebuild would not be purchased. It would be lived into existence one difficult truth at a time. Weeks later, the headlines had cooled. Not disappeared. Scandal never disappears completely, but the city had found fresher things to gossip about. What remained was quieter and therefore more real. Joshua stood on an empty parcel of land on the south side with rolled plans in his hand and wind moving through his coat. The trust had formally launched its first development initiative. Affordable family housing, community-owned retail space, green areas for children, legal protections written into the structure, so no future predator could easily strip it away. The dream he once thought had died in him had returned, not as fantasy, but as burden and assignment exactly as his father had warned. Harold remained involved from a distance, less as ruler now and more as a hard, watchful elder making peace with the fact that control eventually becomes stewardship or it becomes decay. Jessica was no longer in the mansion. She had rented a modest apartment, begun quietly rebuilding her life, and turned down interviews that would have made her famous for the wrong reasons. She started volunteering with a media literacy nonprofit for young girls, teaching them how power, beauty, class, and fear can distort the stories women tell about themselves. It was not glamorous. That was precisely why it mattered. One evening, months later, Jessica met Joshua near the development site as the sun lowered, warm gold across unfinished ground. There were no cameras, no luxury cars, no lawyers, just open space and the sound of workers in the distance. They stood side by side for a moment before speaking. Jessica asked if he was happy. Joshua looked out at the land and answered honestly, "Not every day, but I am finally aligned with my life again." She smiled faintly at that. Then she told him she did not come asking for another chance, because some losses should not be reduced into romantic tests. She only came to say thank you for not letting her become only the worst things she had done. Joshua was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she would carry for years. People are responsible for what they become, but they are also more than the moment that exposes them. Jessica's eyes filled, though this time she did not cry from collapse. She cried from recognition. There is a difference. She wished him well. He wished her truth. And somehow that blessing fit better than love would have in that moment. In the end, nobody truly got what they first wanted. Jessica did not get the fortune. Harold did not get a marriage he could trust. Joshua did not get back the years loss had taken from him. Marcus did not get the legacy he believed blood entitled him to claim. But life is not always built from getting what we want. Sometimes it is built from what survives after illusion burns away. Jessica walked away with no empire, but with something she had not possessed in years, an honest self to begin from. Harold remained wealthy, powerful, and aging, yet perhaps a little less certain that control alone could protect a man from loneliness. Joshua inherited responsibility rather than comfort, and that proved to be the better inheritance anyway, because money by itself could never redeem him. Purpose could. And so the story that began with greed, fear, scandal, and inheritance ended somewhere quieter and truer, not in romance, not in revenge, but in reckoning. And sometimes, for wounded people who have spent too long mistaking survival for wisdom, reckoning is the first real form of grace.